All right, now that we've had the opportunity to explore texture creation, we want to start um, applying that to different forms. So part of this exercise is to stimulate some of your creativity and to get you to thinking about how you wrap things around the volume and form of things. So what we want to do is we want to come in here and just create organic shapes. You can start with pens, you can start with pencils, you can start with pretty much whatever you want. I'll do a version with the lightest value marker that I have. I'll do a version with Prismacolor, and I'll do a version with the pen. The process is going to be all pretty much the same. So what we want to do is we want to look at just making some sort of organic shape. So let's do something like this. Make this pretty organic. Let's have some other form kind of break off of there too, and then we'll just bring this back around and say that's our that's our basic shape and form. So what we want to do is we want to look at this and visualize. Imagine that this has some sort of volume and form to it, and you can shape and craft this volume and form any way that you feel like and that you determine makes sense to you, right? So there is no rule about how these forms should connect. Again, this is really playful things, just so that we have the freedom to explore design, and we have the freedom to a certain degree to make mistakes, and to just play around with, like, how do we effectively apply texture to things that are of different sort of shape, volume, and may not necessarily be a specific thing. Part of your journey is just exploring, making mistakes and making errors, but also trying to figure out how to save drawings. So let's say if we were going to do this one, let's make a little swatch here to determine what this texture would maybe be. Let's see if we can put maybe some sort of, let's say, a brick texture. So we'll do this really quick, make something that's kind of brickish. So we'll break this up. Let's say this is our very simple brick-like texture, and we'll do this pretty quick so it doesn't take an exceptional amount of work. So part of what we want to look at too is, if we're doing these textures, like, are there other things that we can put in here to make them feel more texturally sound? So when you have bricks, like, oftentimes with the bricks, they do have little bits of stone in them. Part of this is also, practicing manipulating, like, various texture types. So you can start to get into the habit of thinking about, how do I handle applying texture to these things? So what I want to do is I'm gonna put some lines on here too, like a little center line that wraps through here. And then keeping in mind too that we're, as much as possible, trying to draw with our arms, because it'll give us the flexibility of being able to move with some degree of fluidity. But our goal is not to be uptight about this. So if you find yourself drawing with your wrist, it's not the end of the world. So let's think about applying really quickly before we get in and start to really try to handle the value on this. Let's just try to wrap these bricks around. So what I would probably do is I would probably mimic and say, let's just drag this line through, maybe drag this line through, right? And I'm gonna add some on this part too. And you don't have to fill up the entirety of this. You can just make some parts and pieces of this half texture. Because again, this is purely just practice. So hopefully the early lines that I've made in here don't become a distraction. So I'll use that line to break up that form, and then I'll use this one because I think it's going to be helpful to keep that pretty consistent. So I'll make one, let's say one right here, and then I'll break this one and I'll break that one. So I just have to remember that that's the line that I want there. And maybe we'll just add one that's on the very edge there, and then we'll do a similar thing here. And you can see that what I'm doing is I'm wrapping around the volume of this to keep it from reading flat, because it's pretty easy to end up making these feel pretty flat with very little effort. Like, you can easily get distracted by, oh, let me make this easy on myself and then end up flattening this out too much. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to visualize that I'm drawing around this volume as much as I possibly can. And maybe I'll put one more, let's add one more layer to this. And that's all I need. I'll just go right there. So again, I'm trying to visualize as much as possible that I'm still wrapping all the way around this volume. So I still want to visualize that I would wrap around, right? Because I want this to feel like it's turning planes, right? I want this to feel like it's turning and that it's wrapping around. I don't want it to end up feeling flat. So I'm still trying to wrap around the volume just as much as possible. So when I'm drawing, I'm getting into the habit of thinking about depth and dimension as much as possible. And then if we want, we could build like some quick gradations and values. We could stipple this really quick to just say, hey, because stippling really does create some nice textural work. And then we can make this part feel a little bit darker and then transitioning into where it gets a little lighter. And you don't have to be super fussy about this either. So don't be precious about it. All right, let's try a nice little thin pin. So pre-practice our motion and then make it happen. Pre-practice our motion and make it happen. Pre-practice, then make it happen. I know that sounds crazy. Like, what do you do? Pre-practice and then make it happen. So I'm gonna try to get around this as much as I can. I'm gonna turn the pad to try to get to an angle that I think I can make these lines as clean as I possibly can. If I happen to break and mess something up or kind of get misaligned, it's not the end of the world. Like these sketchbooks, these are not supposed to be the most finest pieces of art you've ever done in your entire life. This is still practice. So if some of your lines get a little bit shaky or they get a little uneven, it's okay. If you have to draw over a line because maybe you didn't hit it the way you would have liked, that's okay too. So don't get to the place where you start to feel like my lines have to be immaculate and every line that I make has to be completely flawless. That was very risky right there. So now I need to remember like which lines were for what. I think this line is one of them. This line is one of them. This line is one of them. This one's one. And keeping in mind that I'm really trying to make sure that I'm drawing around the volume of these early lines, they definitely help you to make decisions about the things that you need to do. And so you don't really ever want to skip the early sort of sketching and planning phases, because when you skip these sketching and planning phases, you're leaving yourself out there to make potentially some bad decisions. All right, let me rotate this around to figure out what's my ideal angle to make these marks. So I like this angle a little bit better. So I'll bring these lines through. Boop. And if they get a little broken, again, some of these I'm kind of letting it break because they are a breakish pattern. And I don't need the lines to be absolutely flawlessly connected and perfect. Like some of them, if they're break, that it's okay. And if you want, you can pre-practice it here too to get. Unfortunately, I already kind of have an idea, a vision of what I want to do, so I didn't really pre-practice, which it would have suited a little bit to pre-practice, so I have a clear vision. And I'm not completely just, quote unquote, a BSing it. So I'm just gonna hit this with some stipples. And then I'm gonna come back in with another thicker line weight. And the thicker line weight is just to make it, to kind of simulate like a shadow. That's what my thicker line weight is gonna be. That's that's my vision of how I'm using the thicker line weight. Let me get in on this. Ooh, I gotta find the angle. Find the angle. You know you've been drawing digitally too much when you're struggling to hit like the angles that you really want because you're used to just rotating You're used to hitting the rotate canvas. Rotate canvas. All right, that's pretty good. This oddly looks like a cactus. All right, let me find the lines that I wanted. I think this is one of them. So I'll break these up a little bit. But again, I'm still trying to get around the volume of things as much as I possibly can. And I'm trying to avoid making them feel flat. So we'll hit some stipples. Hit some stipples, stipple. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to stipple with the flick on your wrist. You're just going up and down, and you're trying as much as possible to keep that pretty consistent. So there's a couple ways I can build up value. I can go to another marker, so a slightly darker value, to consider like, hey, one, I want to build up the underside of these bricks to make it look like there's some more depth and dimension. And I probably could have like simulated like a little bit of grout, and I want to make a small, I'm trying to make small marks. I don't want to make them perfect. If they're slightly offset from the line, that's actually okay, because it'll make it look a little bit more natural, a little more believable. And the important thing is, with all of these drawings that we're doing, is that we are not trying to render perfect versions of really anything, to be honest. What we're trying to do is we're trying to do more indication, and we're trying to handle impressions more than we're trying to do precision. So if we can handle impression and make things feel like things, we're far better off than if we're trying to make things flawlessly perfect. So what I want to do though is I do want to make it feel like there's a transition of value, like it's slightly darker here, and then it transitions into areas where it gets lighter. And I love a stipple. Stipple is fun. It's fun, and it's I hate to say mindless, but it's a tad mindless when you're stippling things, because you don't have to be super meticulous about it. Of course you can. You can definitely be really meticulous, but you often don't really need to be. And of course I am grossly kind of wrapping around the volume of this just to help continue to push the idea that there's dimension there, because those lines will get a little bit faint, but it'll help carry over the impression and the feeling like there's more depth and dimension there. So I'm going to transition to the much thicker marker, or much thicker pen, and I'm going to shore up some of the lines on this outside. And then I will flick a little bit to let it trail off, and then hit a couple more stipples with the thicker pen, just to make those pop a little more. And then maybe just hit a few spots where there's noticeable plane changes or direction changes, like these little T spots. I feel like there would potentially be maybe a little bit more value there because of the what we would call ambient occlusion, where things are a little bit darker in those spots because the light is not really passing through. So I'm going to add just a little bit of roughness in those areas with the heavier pen. And it's kind of working in conjunction with the marker too, because the marker has a good amount of value to it. And I might come back in. Oh, let me hit the stipples on this too. Stipple. So I've got a couple more things I'm going to drop on here. So I'm going to come in with my darkest marker, and then I'm gonna trail one more edge. Man, that marker did not want to. Oh, oh no, I didn't. So if you're using marker, don't forget your trusty tracing paper because it'll, again, your markers will definitely bleed through. And once they bleed through, then you'll end up having, a whole bunch of ink or a whole bunch of marker on the next page through, which is not the end of the world. It's just now that you've wasted a whole sheet of paper, and like, what's the point? If your pockets are thick like that, don't even worry about it. But if you're like, yo, I don't want to be wasting paper, you definitely want to just be conscious of, like, oh man, don't waste. Be aware, and then I'll just kind of stipple out, draw in, stipple out, draw some of that in, and stipple out. Then put in some verticals too. So I'm gonna try as much as I can to make sure I hit this on the left side, so it appears that that's where most of the shadow is. And then let me put a little bit of value on the cap there. Just because transition of value, like gradation, is really useful and helpful in terms of like making things feel like they have dimension. If you can build transition and value, it'll definitely make things feel like they have more dimension than they really do. So the last thing we'll do is we'll bring our Prismacolor, the white one, and we'll just kind of hit a few areas of where there's some faux light, which is fake light, just to add that extra level of dimension to it. You'll definitely need to keep your pencil sharp. So we'll just kind of hit a few, and then I'll make this feel a little more bumpy than the other pen marks, even though my pen marks feel a little lumpy. And I'm just hitting a couple little lights in a few areas. More than likely, if it was real life, a brick probably wouldn't have like as much of the highlights as I'm kind of putting in there. But for the sake of giving this and making this feel like it has more dimension than it really does, like adding in the extra little bits of highlights just adds an extra bit of pop. Like, highlights make things feel appealing, but they also tend to make things feel more done, more complete, more resolved than they may really be. So, whenever you start to bring in these final highlights, these should be the last things that you do. You don't want to start out with highlights and start just throwing them all over the place, right? Like, your highlights are really reserved things for when you make sense of what you're doing and you feel like you're pretty close to resolving your idea. Then you start dropping in your highlights so you can kind of polish it, round it out. Let's see if we could just get a little bit more value on the underside of this so it turns form a little more. Let's maybe get a little more value on that so it turns form a little bit more. Right, so part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to give these organic forms the impression, the feeling like there's dimension there. Rendering some degree of texture so we can kind of make this sort of organic shape feel like it has this sort of brick pattern, this brick texture on it. So pretending like there's a fake light source that's coming around across the top, giving more dimension on this side than the opposing side. So taking this and transitioning it, placing it on this organic form. And that's a combination of our marker and our pen and our Prismacolor white to get the highlights. So if you practice that, eventually you'll get better at it. And then when you're trying to draw something really quick and create the idea that there's texture on there, you'll become better and better at rendering texture on different shapes and forms. And then you won't necessarily be constrained by, I need to see what this thing looks like. That it has to exist in reality, that you can make up stuff and it still feel tangible and believable.